Hello, and welcome back to Finding a Founder. Today marks the beginning of our two-part finale, in which we discuss Franklin's life in London, the last location in our series. In this episode, we're going to discuss what London was like in the mid-18th century, how and why Benjamin Franklin came to be here, what he got up to in and around the city, and learn all about his inner circle of friends. We also learn a bit about the history of number 36 Craven Street, otherwise known as Benjamin Franklin House in the 21st century, the world's only remaining Franklin residence. When considering who to invite as my guest for today, there was only one name on my list, George Goodwin. As author of the fittingly titled book, Benjamin Franklin in London, George is the leading expert in what we're going to be covering in the next two episodes. Coincidentally, George has also served as our author in residence here at Benjamin Franklin House since 2015, and I'm delighted to welcome him on today's show. George Goodwin, hello.
Hello, Henry. Thank you very much for including me. I think this is going to be very interesting for us.
Very interesting indeed. So let's get straight into it. Benjamin Franklin moves to London in 1757, but what was London like in the 18th century?
Well, traditionally, London, in terms of Greater London, was actually two cities. There was the city of Westminster, which was the centre of government and administration, and the city of London. These were the two traditional cities. Also, there was the borough of Southwark, which was south of the river. Now, the great change as far as the 18th century architecture of the city of London was concerned was, of course, the Great Fire of 1666, which that stretched to the west almost as far as Temple Bar, which was the city's boundary with Westminster, and to the east to the Tower of London. Of course, it was blocked to the south by the River Thames, but northwards it reached almost as far as the old city wall at Moorgate. And London's reconstruction under Wren took almost half a century, with its greatest jewel, St. Paul's, wasn't finished until 1711. And of course, it was the great jewel then, and quite frankly, it still is.
Very nice. So it would have been visible to Franklin when he arrived over 40 years later. But what was London like in terms of how big it was? You talked about there being essentially two cities, east and west. But how many people lived there? What were the streets like? How bustly was it back in the 80s?
In the century before Franklin's arrival in 1757, as a representative of the Assembly of Pennsylvania, there had been a great westward expansion since the end of the 17th century, taking in what are still the wealthy areas of Mayfair and as far as Park Lane and Hyde Park. And to the north, it went as far as modern Oxford Street and a little beyond. Now, the estimates of population vary, but in 1750, we can say it was around 750,000, and it had grown around 30% in the previous half century. But that was not due to natural increase. I mean, London was a filthy, disease-ridden place where deaths would exceed births until well into the next century. I mean, it was basically swelled by people coming to London to try their luck. And it was with good reason that Daniel Defoe, between 1724 and 1726, described in his A Tour Through the Whole Island of Great Britain, which was published at that time, as a great and monstrous thing. And that incidentally, that was the very time when Franklin first came to London as a teenage printer, but not a shy one. I mean, he joined Coffee House Society and the notorious Bernard Mandeville, whose anti-church views had led to a trial. And Franklin not only met Sir Hans Sloane, who was number 2 at the Royal Society and soon to be its president, but he sold him an asbestos purse. And Franklin also took note of his experiences from his reading Defoe and others. And all this would give him the precedence and inspiration to found the great institutions linked with his name in Philadelphia.
So there's quite a few things you've mentioned there that I'd like to talk a bit more about. You mentioned lots of people moving to London. You mentioned Franklin actually coming to London as an apprentice printer, which we'll come back to. And you mentioned Sir Hans Sloane as well, which we'll talk about. But first, I wonder if you could talk a bit more about people coming to London, I suppose, looking for work. And what kind of work was there? What was driving the economy of the city at this time?
Well, basically everything. I mean, London was the was the big metropolis. I mean, when you consider that the next biggest city in England was Bristol, and that was only 30,000. I mean, it was tiny in comparison to London. And also, you have to bear in mind that between November and June every year, Parliament sat, and the entire aristocracy and a lot of the squirearchy who were members of the Commons would come to London, and they would drive the luxury trades. So after June, London would then return to, they'd all go to their country houses to escape the summer. And as I said, it was a filthy and disease-ridden city. To escape that, and of course, if you were in the luxury goods, you didn't have any work. I mean, it was quite simple as that. So you had to try and make as much as you could over those winter and spring months. And so, okay, it was a very small percentage of the population, but they were the people with all the money.
So as well as people coming from within Great Britain to London to look for work, to look for a life, Franklin, as you mentioned, actually came to London earlier as a young man to work as a trainee printer. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the time that he was there in his late teens.
Yes, well, as I said before, he was hardly shy and retiring. Initially, he actually came over. He thought that the governor of Pennsylvania had set him up to go and buy a the machinery of printing, all that was required. And he got to London and discovered that for some reason he just couldn't understand, and nobody can understand. It was some kind of joke by Keith to try and get rid of him. And so he found that he was in London and didn't have a job. However, he was a trained printer, and that was something which actually there was a great need for because there was an explosion in print in terms of the first newspaper in London, a proper daily newspaper, was in 1707. By the time Franklin came to London in 1724, there were a lot of newspapers. There was a whole sort of printing area around Little Britain, and he had no trouble at all finding work. And his skills were seen. I mean, he started off basically in sort of lower grade work, but then he soon became a compositor, which is the thing that you wanted to be. So, he got a lot of printing experience, but actually he already had established himself as a proper printer back in Philadelphia. But it was useful. It was very useful for him, as I said, because through his reading, through meeting people such as Sir Hans Sloane, in fact, he wanted to meet Sir Isaac Newton, and he was promised that he would meet Sir Isaac Newton, not by Sloane, but by somebody else. But it fell through. I mean, Newton was actually almost at the end of his life, and he was not in good health. But Franklin was still inspired. So in the famous portrait of Franklin from 1766 by David Martin, there's a bust, and it's a bust of Sir Isaac Newton. And Franklin took, if you like, the cultural experience of London back to Philadelphia, as I said, and as a result, he founded all these institutions. He founded the Library Company, the American Philosophical Society. He set up the Junto, which was based on the club. He even set up, later on, he set up a hospital, first hospital in Philadelphia. And so it went on. Oh, yes. And of course, from Defoe, the idea of having a proper fire service. So that all came from London.
And we heard from some of those institutions that you mentioned just now in our earlier episodes. And it's nice to bring it all back to London in these final few episodes of the series. You mentioned Hans Sloane. It's probably worth talking a bit about who he was. He was the eventual founder of the British Museum. And you said that Franklin gave him a asbestos purse.
Sold him, Henry.
Sold him an asbestos purse.
Yes.
And I presume that would somewhere be in their collection still. I don't know.
It is somewhere in their collection, but because it's asbestos, it's not on public view, as you can imagine. In fact, actually, it tells you quite a lot about Franklin, because the letter that he sent to Sloane is still, it still exists. And in that, though it was in 1726, and he had been in London for some time by then, he pretended that he was only here for a short time to Sloane, with the idea of the old advertising slogan of hurry now to avoid disappointment, and Sloane bit, and he invited Franklin to show him the purse, and as Sloane was interested in lots of different curiosities, hence the collection, which then became the foundation collection of the British Museum, he purchased it.
From an early age, he had mastered networking, which served him well for the remainder of his life. You also mentioned earlier something about coffee houses. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the London coffee house scene and possibly where Franklin might have frequented during his time in 1757 onwards.
Okay, well, of course, when he was over the first time, he enjoyed going to coffee houses. I mean, the whole point of coffee houses it was not just to drink coffee. It was a social center to have a chat and to read the newspapers. So, and the newspapers, by the time he came back in 1757, it is estimated that a third of the population of London, 750,000, so we're talking about 250,000 people, would have access to the newspapers, because you would have many, many people reading each copy in the coffee houses. Now, you'd have, literacy was not complete, but no problem, because people would actually read passages to others from the newspapers. So it was, if you like, it was a center of discourse and sociability, and absolutely suited Franklin completely. Also, with the Pennsylvania coffee house, that was where Franklin would go and pick up his mail. So it was a post office as well, effectively.
So essentially, a lot of the information coming from the colonies into London would have arrived via the coffee houses.
It would indeed. But how did it get there in the first place? Well, of course, it would come by ship, and if you wanted the latest news, then you would rely on the mail packet, which were the fastest ships, which would go into Falmouth in Cornwall, which incidentally is the third deepest port, if you like, in the world. It's very deep. Sydney and Rio de Janeiro are the other two.
I did not know that.
No.
So you mentioned that the mail packets were some of the fastest. How long would it take for information to travel to and from the colonies?
On average, about 6 weeks to get from Falmouth to the ports on the East Coast.
And what about travel within Great Britain itself? So you've obviously got lots of ports, but what about within the country? How easy was it to travel from, for example, London to Bristol?
Well, the roads were starting to improve. Put it that way. They were starting to improve, all part of the ongoing industrial revolution. But it could still, in bad weather, just like now when the railways don't work, wrong type of snow, or rain, or leaves on the line, you would have problems with delays of the coaches. But things were definitely getting better.
So we've talked a lot about the economy of London, the industry that was there, but what about forms of entertainment, things that you might do in your pastime when you were there?
Well, there was the theatre, and the theatre, riotous places could be. If in the pit for basically the poor people, if they didn't like your performance, it would be oranges and rotten oranges and vegetables and whatever, even bottles would be thrown at the performers. So it was a place where all classes met, put it that way. Now, Franklin did go a bit after 1757, but not as much as during his first time in London. The reason being that he had a completely different social network, which were his clubs. And it was the clubs that he went and really enjoyed himself. But I think we're going to come back to that in a moment, because I think we need to talk about why he was there and why he came to Craven Street and Mrs. Stevenson.
That's right. So we'll come back to his more the social aspect of his time in London. But as you said, Franklin, he arrives in 1757. But who sent him there, and what was his mission?
Well, he was sent there by the Assembly of Pennsylvania, and it was to try and get the proprietors of Pennsylvania, the Penn family, Thomas Penn and his brother Richard, who were sons of William Penn, obviously the founder of Pennsylvania, and try and get them to pay some tax. Now, you might find that get them to pay. What's going on? Surely that as they owned an area which was almost as big as England, you would think, right, okay, well, they would take a very, very active role, that they would fund everything. Didn't actually work like that. The Assembly was elected, but the Penns actually owned Pennsylvania, and how they funded themselves was by quit rents, which is basically like they held the freehold, then you paid a quit rent, which was like you had everything in leasehold. They had a phenomenal amount of money, but as I said, they didn't take an active role because they were based in London, and they sent lieutenants over to manage the place, and they even, they stopped being adherents of their father's whole approach to life, religion, and et al. They became members of the Church of England and members of the British aristocracy, with, as I said, very little interest. So what they would do occasionally, if the country was the country of Pennsylvania, if it was under threat, the Assembly would petition them for some money. Could you please give us some money because the French are about to invade? And this is effectively one of a major reason why Franklin turned up in 1757.
So Franklin was in London to speak to the proprietors of Pennsylvania, but why did he choose to lodge at 36 Craven Street? What was it that drew him to this particular house?
Well, what drew him there was, account books can be actually very interesting. And in his account book, it shows that he gave Craven Street and Mrs. Stevenson, the landlady, a trial, went there for a meal. And the meal went extremely well. So he moved in. And except, obviously, for the period late 1762 to 1764, when he went back to Philadelphia, he moved in and he didn't move out until March 1775.
Do we know how he came across 36 Craven Street? Was it during his journey over here, or was he recommended it by somebody?
He was recommended it. I mean, when he arrived, he stayed with Peter Collinson, either in Mill Hill or in Peter Collinson's Grace Church Street house, which is just north of London Bridge. And we'll talk about all his vast number of people that he knew before coming over, but Peter Collinson was an important one. And then he stayed in the Bear Inn, just over the bridge in Southwark, for a couple of nights, and then tried Mrs. Stevenson, and it worked extremely well.
So he came for a meal. He liked the meal. He met the landlady, Margaret. But was there anything else about Craven Street that was particularly useful for Franklin during his time?
It was perfectly positioned. It was very, very handy for. You could say that it was placed between Westminster and government, as I said, and administration. That was a short trip, and also close to the Strand, which was a great printing area in the 1750s. And Franklin was able to go meet lots of people in bookshops, not too far away from the city either. And if he wanted to go further west into the new areas of Mayfair, again, it wouldn't take him too long. And I'll tell you why it wouldn't take him too long. He had his own coach. And the reason he had his own coach was because, as he himself said, if you got the standard taxis of the time, the Hackney coaches, they were filthy, and they were not the kind of vehicle that you could turn up in at the doorstep of the great and the good. You basically had to have your own coach, and for this he paid 12 guineas a month, which is a very lot of money. And it's quite interesting because he didn't claim for expenses until he got back to Philadelphia in 1762, and he actually had quite a lot of trouble getting his expenses cleared, because not only did he have the coach, but he had all kinds of other things that, for instance, when he went to Europe on tour, he took his son William, and they objected to him claiming for that as well, all his travel expenses. But he proved to be valuable enough that they sent him back in 1764. But actually, I did try and do a sort of comparison with today. I mean, it's a bit like having your own helicopter on standby. So I phoned up a helicopter renting company, and I said, well, how much would it cost to have a helicopter on standby the whole time? And they said, no, I'm afraid things don't work like that. You do it by trip. But he needed to have the coach on standby just in case he got a letter from somebody important and he needed to act immediately.
And I presume he paid rent as well whilst he was lodging at Craven Street. Do we know roughly how much rent he paid and whether he paid it with his own money?
Yes, he did pay it with his own money, but again, it was part of his expenses. The exact amount, I don't know, actually. I should know, but I don't know. But on occasion, he was a little bit in arrears. But Mrs. Stevenson was very good. In fact, he was in arrears when he left in haste in 1775. But he damn well made sure that she got paid. So he did manage to get the money over to her, even though America was then at war with Britain.
So Franklin, as we've just said, he was lodging at 36 Craven Street. He was paying rent. But who else was actually in the house when he was there? Who was his landlady, for example?
Well, his landlady was Margaret Stevenson, who had lived there and been the landlady for people previously since 1748. So she was sort of well established. And she created a home from home. I mean, he had the best rooms on the first floor for Britain and the second floor for Americans, with a nice view of the street, all shuttered up. So when he did his early morning routine of wandering around in the nude, which he found extremely refreshing, the showers were it was called a sort of a natural shower, if you like, and the shutters were quite useful. So she made this home from home, and there was also a daughter of the house, young Polly, and he became very fond of Polly. In fact, when he went back in 1762, not sure that he was going to return to Craven Street, though Mrs. Stevenson actually kept the place free for him to return. I mean, he was the only lodger, so no, she was paid during this time just in case he would return. And but on that first trip, he wrote from Portsmouth before taking ship to Polly a rather sort of a very emotional letter, saying that how upset he was that he wasn't going to see her again. And I actually find that quite difficult to read when I give talks, because it really does. He really sort of pulls at the heartstrings. It's excellent. And then there were others in the house, of course, those that he brought with him. He had his son William, who acted as his secretary, and they also brought two enslaved servants. They brought Peter, who was Benjamin Franklin's own sort of personal servant, and Williams, who was called King. And so Peter was incredibly helpful to his master. Sorry to use that term. When Franklin was very ill soon after he arrived, when he contracted malaria. And it was a busy time for Franklin, but he couldn't get out for some time. So Peter would race around with messages for him. And meanwhile, of course, William was having a whale of a time. He became a close friend of the Duke of Northumberland, and more to the point, with Earl Percy, his son, who introduced him into aristocratic society. So that was a very good sort of move for William. Now, King actually, he did a runner, and the Franklins had to track him down. And they did so. They tracked him down to an old lady in Suffolk, I mean, some distance away, who was teaching him various musical instruments. And King was showing great dexterity with his music. And they decided that actually, as he was incredibly happy, they left him there.
So King had been taken in, but what happened to Peter? Do we know anything about Franklin's servant, as you say?
Yes, well, Peter stayed with him during that trip. He wasn't there on the return. There's very little mention of who the servant that accompanied him in 1764. There's mention of a John who behaved very well, but we don't know whether he was enslaved or whether he was a servant, and he sort of disappears from. There's only just one mention in a letter from Benjamin Franklin to his wife Deborah. Now, of course, Deborah didn't come with him and to London, and the reason given was that she had an absolute terror of traveling by ship. She was very frightened, in the same way as some people are actually very frightened of traveling by air now. She was terrified of ship travel. She had a point, actually, because when they came over, when the Franklin party came over in 1757, they were almost wrecked on the rocks of the Scilly Isles, just as the southwest of Cornwall, where many ships have been wrecked. And it was only because, I mean, the boy who was on the lookout, he was asleep. The captain was downstairs in his cabin. It was only because there was a naval captain who happened to be a passenger who was on deck, called Archibald Kennedy, who saved the day. He had just enough time to steer the ship away from the rocks. But otherwise, that would have been the end of Benjamin Franklin. And actually, Franklin, when he arrived at Falmouth, he actually went into a church. Not really because he was more of a deist than anything else, but he thought it would be polite to say thank you for having been saved, and completely right. But it was convenient. It was convenient that Deborah didn't come, because had his wife come, she would have been expected to be the person who entertained people. So it was convenient that she didn't come. I mean, because he didn't have a wife there, it was completely reasonable for him to go to places on his own.
And Deborah, whilst she remained in Philadelphia, did have a role in managing Franklin's affairs in America. Is that right?
Completely. I mean, she was his business partner, and it doesn't reflect very well on our hero, really. His treatment of Deborah, I mean, even after she had a couple of strokes towards the end of his stay in London, and she'd been waiting. She'd always been expecting him to come back, and he would said, "Oh, well, I will come back. It won't be too long." Blah blah blah, and he couldn't drag himself away. I mean, he just so loved being in London. So, and in fact, of course, she died the winter before he did return in 1775. So it's quite a sad part of the story. I mean, he'd even he basically, even during that time after she'd had the strokes, he expected her to be going at full tilt, managing his affairs, but she wasn't able to. I mean, even his son William, who was even when William was governor of New Jersey, as he became, he was still sort of hesitant of telling his father off, but he told his father off about that.
So just to summarize, Franklin, he arrives in London in 1757. He lodges at Craven Street with Margaret Stevenson and her daughter Polly, initially on a mission to speak with the Penns. He ends up staying for 5 years, returns to Philadelphia in 1762, not knowing if he would ever go back to London, but he does so in 1764, this time without Peter and King, the two enslaved individuals that he had initially brought with him, possibly with a different person called John, but we're not entirely sure how long or what capacity that relationship was. So let's talk about 1764. Franklin's now back in London. He's been in Philadelphia for 18 months. He would have seen his wife for the last time, although neither of them really knew that at the time. And as you said, he would remain now in London until pretty much the eve of Revolution, 1775. So during that period, 1764 to 1775, what was Franklin doing and who was he operating with? Who was his inner circle during those 11 years?
Well, also, I mean, we can actually, sorry to sort of slightly backtrack, but very much the same people as before, because when he came over, he initially stayed, just really, as I said, for a night or two with Peter Collinson. So Collinson was a key man. He was also key in another sense because he had been the person with Dr. John Fothergill. They were both Quakers who had supported Franklin's electricity experiments and the publication of his experiments and observations on electricity in Philadelphia that was actually based on letters that Franklin had written to Collinson that won him the Copley Medal, which was the equivalent of winning the Nobel Prize today. So that was his entry card, if you like. He had other friends such as the printer William Strawn, who he'd been in long correspondence with. They were sort of pen friends. And also somebody like Richard the Omniscient Jackson. And his nickname was the Omniscient Jackson. This was a lawyer, and he was also a colonial representative in London, who was basically interested in everything that Franklin was interested in. In fact, yes, the Omniscient was not liked by Dr. Johnson. He preferred all-knowing because omniscient, that was basically God's role. All-knowing was okay for Jackson. And when he came over, he had all kinds of other friends that he immediately made, such as John Canton and William Watson, and they were the people who proposed him for the Copley Medal, the equivalent of the Nobel Prize. And then there was Sir John Pringle, who was president of the Royal Society. So Franklin was an outsider. I mean, he was the first Briton outside the British Isles to win the Copley Medal, which he won in 1753. And of course, he got a fellowship of the Royal Society that followed that. But I mean, he may have been an outsider, but he became an insider because, he was warmly welcomed because of his position in the Royal Society and in the Royal Society of Arts and Manufacture and Commerce as well, that he became a member, a key fellow of, in fact. So you talked about as kind of inner circle. It was an ever-widening circle that he had. And one just has to look at the people that he stayed with. I mean, and who he traveled with. So he traveled to Germany and France twice with Pringle. Richard Jackson went with him to Scotland and Ireland. And on the way back to Scotland, Franklin stayed with David Hume. In fact, Franklin loved Scotland. I mean, Strawn introduced him to all kinds of people, not only Hume, but the Scottish intellectual elites, people like William Robertson, Adam Ferguson. And he also went with Canton and with the Dutch physician and scientist Jan Ingenhouse to the Midlands and the North. They had a tour of the great industrial sites. They went to go and see Matthew Boulton just outside Birmingham. In fact, Franklin went several times to one can say play with Matthew Bolton's great sort of machinery. And Franklin stayed with Erasmus Darwin in Lichfield and met up with the Lunar Society. So, I mean, that was one group. And then he also had other people, such as Jonathan Shipley, who's the Bishop of St. Asaph, stay with him in Hampshire. And of course, he stayed with Francis Dashwood, who was his boss at the post office, because we must remember that Franklin was deputy postmaster for North America at this time, has certain advantages. I mean, he had advantages to him back in Philadelphia with his newspaper, because that could be posted free, but also posting letters and packages was very expensive, but he also got that free as well. So he had an extremely wide circle of friends. I think we should talk about his social life, but was also his intellectual life, which was clubs all based on the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Art. So, I mean, he was a member of half a dozen clubs in London, and that's where he would go and be entertained and talk away. And they were all slightly different. There was the Royal Society Club, and there it was quite formal, and he ate incredibly well there. I mean, for instance, I'll give you. Would you like a menu? Would you like a menu of what they had at the Royal Society Club?
I would love a menu. Yes.
Okay. So this is the food on offer. So I'll go through it. They had salmon and smelts. Now smelts, that's actually salmon and small salmon, because smelts are small salmon. Then they had trout and flatfish, fowls and bacon, roast beef, goose roast, pigeon pie, peas, and then onto the puddings. They had plum pudding, of course. You know, that was the great dish for showing you were English. Then they had codling pie cream. Now that's not a return to fish. Codling is actually a type of apple, which is very good because it doesn't crush up. It keeps its shape in a pie. And then they had currant and cherry pie, and then they had butter and cheese, and all this was washed down with extremely good claret. Now it was slightly different. That was a major club. Another club was the Monday Club. But I mean, what was the point? What was the point of the clubs as far as Franklin was concerned? I mean, he wrote to a friend, Hugh Roberts, in America, and he described why he liked them so much. He said, "I find I love company, chat, a laugh, a glass, and even a song, as well as ever, and at the same time relish, better than I used to do, the grave observations and wise sentences of old men's conversations." And then he wrote, in another example, is when he wrote to John Ellicott about the Monday Club when he was back in America. And he said, "The Monday scarce comes round, but I think of you and am present with you in spirit, and shall take it kindly if, when you are not crowded, you order a chair for me, and only caution one another not to tread upon my toes." Now, how was Franklin at these clubs? Well, there's a quote from Joseph Priestley, who by the end of Franklin's time in London really was one of his closest friends. And bearing in mind, it was 1775, so, you know, Franklin was slightly more cautious by then, obviously, particularly as he was about to leave for America, as everything was coming to a head as far as the relationship and the colonies was concerned. But Priestley observed, in terms of when Franklin was in the club, he said, "To strangers he was cold and reserved, but where he was intimate, no man indulged to more pleasantry and good humor." So basically by then, absolutely fine with people he knew, but if he didn't know someone, he might observe them for about half an hour or so before he actually thought they were someone who could be trusted. And that actually shows a kind of development of Franklin, but also a development of how things stood between Britain and the colonies.
So clearly, Benjamin Franklin had quite a good time in London. It's no surprise that he stayed as long as he did. However, it wasn't all perfect and sunshine and rainbows. We'll hear in the next episode about some of the challenges that he faced, especially during the build-up to the American Revolution. But George, I wonder, just to end this episode, if you could summarize Franklin's overall love of London and his time in a more social lens in the city.
Well, he loved it. In fact, one could say, I think, without any likelihood of contradiction, that he was probably at his happiest in London because he had all these people that he'd corresponded with at his fingertips. He had this club life that he loved, and he got to meet the movers and shakers in politics as well. So he was at the center of things, and Franklin liked being at the center of things. And let's remember that he was self-sufficient financially because he'd been incredibly successful in business as a printer in America. And so that he was not exactly fancy free, but he could really have an enjoyable time. He was sort of master of his own destiny.
Thank you very much, George Goodwin. If you'd like to hear more about Franklin's time in London, we'll be talking about his political escapades in the second part of this two-part episode, again with George Goodwin. George, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you. It's been great fun.
Next time, in our final episode of Finding a Founder, George and I will be discussing how Franklin played a vital role in the build-up to the American Revolution, despite being over 3,000 miles away here in London. We'll be discussing all the key moments, including how Franklin responded to events already mentioned in previous episodes of Finding a Founder, such as the Stamp Act and Boston Tea Party, as well as the other defining milestones that influenced Franklin's metamorphosis from loyal subject to American patriot and founding father. Until then, thank you for listening and goodbye.